I was glad the temptation was gone. I felt that it would be more delicate to learn what I wanted to know of Miss Trelawny's surroundings from herself, rather than from her servants. We bowled swiftly along Knightsbridge, the small noise of our well-appointed vehicle sounding hollowly in the morning air. We turned up the Kensington Palace Road and presently stopped opposite a great house on the left-hand side, nearer, so far as I could judge, the Notting Hill than the Kensington end of the avenue. It was a truly fine house, not only with regard to size but to architecture. Even in the dim grey light of the morning, which tends to diminish the size of things, it looked big. Miss Trelawny met me in the hall. She was not in any way shy. She seemed to rule all around her with a sort of high-bred dominance, all the more remarkable as she was greatly agitated and as pale as snow. In the great hall were several servants, the men standing together near the hall door, and the women clinging together in the further corners and doorways. A police superintendent had been talking to Miss Trelawny. Two men in uniform and one plainclothesman stood near him. As she took my hand impulsively, there was a look of relief in her eyes, and she gave a gentle sigh of relief. Her salutation was simple. "I knew you would come." The clasp of the hand can mean a great deal, even when it is not intended to mean anything especially. Miss Trelawny's hand somehow became lost in my own. It was not that it was a small hand; it was fine and flexible, with long delicate fingers; a rare and beautiful hand; it was the unconscious self-surrender. And though at the moment I could not dwell on the cause of the thrill which swept me, it came back to me later. She turned and said to the police superintendent: "This is Mr. Malcolm Ross." The police officer saluted as he answered: "I know Mr. Malcolm Ross, miss. Perhaps he will remember I had the honour of working with him in the Brixton coining case." I had not at first glance noticed who it was, my whole attention having been taken with Miss Trelawny. "Of course, Superintendent Dolan, I remember very well," I said as we shook hands. I could not but note that the acquaintanceship seemed a relief to Miss Trelawny. There was a certain vague uneasiness in her manner which took my attention. Instinctively I felt that it would be less embarrassing for her to speak with me alone. So I said to the Superintendent: "Perhaps it will be better if Miss Trelawny will see me alone for a few minutes. You, of course, have already heard all she knows, and I shall understand better how things are if I may ask some questions. I will then talk the matter over with you if I may." "I shall be glad to be of what service I can, sir," he answered heartily. Following Miss Trelawny, I moved over to a dainty room which opened from the hall and looked out on the garden at the back of the house. When we had entered and I had closed the door, she said: "I will thank you later for your goodness in coming to me in my trouble, but at present you can best help me when you know the facts." "Go on," I said. "Tell me all you know, and spare no detail, however trivial it may at the present time seem to be." She went on at once: "I was awakened by some sound, I do not know what. I only know that it came through my sleep, for all at once I found myself awake, with my heart beating wildly, listening anxiously for some sound from my father's room. My room is next Father's, and I can often hear him moving about before I fall asleep. He works late at night, sometimes very late indeed, so that when I wake early, as I do occasionally, or in the grey of the dawn, I hear him still moving. I tried once to remonstrate with him about staying up so late, as it cannot be good for him, but I never ventured to repeat the experiment. You know how stern and cold he can be; at least you may remember what I told you about him, and when he is polite in this mood he is dreadful. When he is angry I can bear it much better, But when he is slow and deliberate, and the side of his mouth lifts up to show the sharp teeth, I think I feel, I don't know how. Last night I got up softly and stole to the door, for I really feared to disturb him. There was not any noise of moving, and no kind of cry at all, but there was a queer kind of dragging sound, and a slow, heavy breathing. Oh, it was dreadful, waiting there in the dark and the silence, and fearing I did not know what. At last I took my courage à deux mains, and turning the handle as softly as I could, I opened the door a tiny bit. It was quite dark within; I could just see the outline of the windows. But in the darkness the sound of breathing, becoming more distinct, was appalling. As I listened this continued, but there was no other sound. I pushed the door open all at once. I was afraid to open it slowly; I felt as if there might be some dreadful thing behind it ready to pounce out on me. Then I switched on the electric light and stepped into the room. I looked first at the bed. The sheets were all crumpled up so that I knew Father had been in bed, but there was a great dark red patch in the center of the bed and spreading to the edge of it that made my heart stand still. As I was gazing at it, the sound of the breathing came across the room, and my eyes followed to it. There was Father on his right side with the other arm under him, just as if his dead body had been thrown there all in a heap. The track of blood went across the room up to the bed, and there was a pool all around him which looked terribly red and glittering as I bent over to examine him. The place where he lay was right in front of the big safe. He was in his pajamas. The left sleeve was torn, showing his bare arm, and stretched out toward the safe. It looked, oh, so terrible, patched all with blood, and with the flesh torn or cut all around a gold chain bangle on his wrist. I did not know he wore such a thing, and it seemed to give me a new shock of surprise. She paused a moment, and as I wished to relieve her by a moment's divergence of thought, I said: "Oh, that need not surprise you. You will see the most unlikely men wearing bangles. I have seen a judge condemn a man to death, and the wrist of the hand he held up had a gold bangle." She did not seem to heed much the words or the idea. The pause, however, relieved her somewhat, and she went on in a steadier voice: "I did not lose a moment in summoning aid, for I feared he might bleed to death. I rang the bell, and then went out and called for help as loudly as I could. In what must have been a very short time, though it seemed an incredibly long one to me, some of the servants came running up, and then others, till the room seemed full of staring eyes, and disheveled hair, and night clothes of all sorts. We lifted Father on a sofa, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Grant, who seemed to have her wits about her more than any of us, began to look where the flow of blood came from. In a few seconds it became apparent that it came from the arm which was bare. There was a deep wound, not clean cut as with a knife, but like a jagged rent or tear, close to the wrist, which seemed to have cut into the vein. Mrs. Grant tied a handkerchief round the cut, and screwed it up tight with a silver paper cutter, and the flow of blood seemed to be checked at once. By this time I had come to my senses, or such of them as remained, and I sent off one man for the doctor and another for the police. When they had gone, I felt that, except for the servants, I was all alone in the house, and that I knew nothing of my father or anything else, and a great longing came to me to have someone with me who could help me. Then I thought of you and your kind offer in the boat under the willow tree, and without waiting to think, I told the men to get a carriage ready at once, and I scribbled a note and sent it on to you." She paused. I did not like to say just then anything of how I felt. I looked at her. I think she understood, for her eyes were raised to mine for a moment and then fell, leaving her cheeks as red as peony roses. With a manifest effort she